Great. Okay. Good afternoon, class, and welcome back to Environmental Science 12. So yesterday we looked at some information about climate and effects on climate. And the two main effects I believe that we discussed were latitude and what was the other one? Altitude? I don't have it there. But today we're going to be looking at these other two things that affect climate: ocean currents and local geography. Ocean currents, you have a pretty good idea what's been happening lately in the news. Hurricanes. This is hurricane season down in the Caribbean, and typhoon season in the Pacific. In the terms of these storms, anything that happens in the Atlantic is called a hurricane, and the big storms in the Pacific are called typhoons. So there's a big one in typhoon that hit Philippines and destroying villages in the last couple of days. It's moving on to China. And we just heard in the news about Hurricane Florence that's been downgraded. It hit land in South Carolina. There's still a lot of flooding going on there. It wasn't so much the storms. They did break trees and that, but the worst part is the rain. The rivers are swelling and it's flooding. And what we have today in Bathurst is probably the north extension of this. We don't have the storm, but we're getting that cold depression. I don't know if anybody noticed yesterday, it was like 35, 37 with humidity, around 5:30, and then around 6:30, bang, it was like 18 degrees. And you could feel, like the wind came up amazing. That was a front. That was a cold front coming in and hit that warm air, and just as all of a sudden the temperature dropped, like over 10 degrees. It's just amazing how quick it went. Okay, so there will be an assignment, and it'll be entitled Assignment 5, Climate Part B, and that'll be on your pickup box or be at the end of this video for the people at home. So, ocean currents. Now, the reason why I mentioned hurricanes, because what happens in the Caribbean is the warm air, during the summer there, starts to rise, and the circulation from a lot of the global patterns start to create these funnels and eventually develop in these great big hurricanes. Now, climates are also affected by the way the water moves, the currents. There are some cold water currents that come down from Labrador that affect us, but we also have warm currents that come up. And if you may have heard that the beaches in New Brunswick, like in Shediac, are some of the warmest beaches in the Atlantic, NPEI. Is because we have what's called the Gulf Stream. And I think I'll show it to you when it comes through there. It flows from down south, comes across right by New Brunswick, and then goes right across the Atlantic to England. And it keeps their climate relatively warm compared to a lot of the European countries. So what are currents caused by in the ocean? Well, mainly by winds and the rotation of the Earth. Now we know the Earth rotates on an axis, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And that spinning of the axis and the winds that are created by air circulation is what drives the currents in the ocean. Water can hold a lot of heat, and even today, you probably went to the beach, the water still be warm compared to the air. And if you went in the springtime, you probably noticed that it's springtime, it's getting warm, but the water's ice cold. It takes a while for the water to warm up, but when it is warm, it holds the heat for a longer time than the air. So water holds a large amount of heat, and it can actually be layered. So you may have the surface of the water, and it goes down, and what you have, of course, it's warmer, it's going to get cooler, and it's going to get cold as you go down. So there is a temperature gradient as you go deeper and deeper in the water. If you ever swim in the Bay of Fundy, it's some of the coldest waters around. You're swimming on the top, maybe a foot or two, and then if you dive down, bang, talk about brain freeze. It'll hit you just like a ton of bricks. Lake Superior in Ontario's like that. So big Lake Superior is one of the biggest lakes in the world. And the top of the lake, you can swim, but if you dive, wow. It is cold. Oceans tend to moderate climates, making coastal areas usually warmer winters and cooler summers. What's that mean is that if you look at the areas like Halifax and Vancouver, they usually have warmer weather, warmer winters than do the center part of the country, like in Winnipeg. And if you went to look at in the summertime, it's actually cooler there than if you went to some of the central part of the country, because the water moderates. It means it'll stabilize it. It won't make extremes. It's not going to be super hot in the summer. It's not going to be super cold in the winter. So the coastal waters moderate that. And coastal areas tend to get more rainfall. Well, we know that. I mean, we can see a lot here in New Brunswick. We're on the Bay Chaleur. You went to Halifax, the same thing. Or if you went inland, the central part, the prairie provinces, they'll have droughts there a lot, because if they don't get enough rain, their crops will die. But normally we'll have more rainfall along the coast, because we get a lot of evaporation from the ocean. So there's a lot more vapor coming from the ocean itself. So just looking at this map here of the world, it gives you a general idea. If you can see a bit of those lines, those are generally how these currents will run. So you see here in the Pacific, the water makes a cycle like this. It comes from west to east, up towards the north, and then as you get towards the equator, it flows in an easterly direction. And you can see here as well, it funnels like this in the Atlantic, the South Atlantic. It branches off this way, going up to the northeast of the Atlantic, and comes down this way here past Greenland. So all over the world we'll have these great big global patterns. And the marine animals actually know this, and they'll follow this. And they'll use that to go to where they have to breed. Like a lot of the big animals, like whales, will go down, to the south, the Antarctic, where there's lots of food that they need to survive. And that's where they'll mate, and then they'll have their babies, and they can come back up and to the northern parts after their babies are born. So if we look at the map here, Vancouver and Winnipeg are at about the same latitude. So if I were to mark it on the map, here's Winnipeg, right of course to the southern border of Canada with the United States, and there's Vancouver right here in the southern part of BC. So they're right at the same latitude. However, their climate is quite different. The average high temperature in Winnipeg in January, the highest temperature there in Vancouver is less than the high temperature in Winnipeg. And if you go to the summer in the month of July, the average low temperature, so say it's, I don't know, say 20 or 25 degrees, is about the same as the average high in Vancouver, meaning that it doesn't get too hot here and doesn't get too cold, because the water moderates it. Here they'll have extremes. They'll get up to 30 degrees, plus 30, and it'll go down to minus 30 or even more in Winnipeg. Big extremes. They say Portage in Maine, a corner in Winnipeg, is one of the coldest spots in Canada. I lived there for 7 years, so I can attest to that. It's very, very cold. So what causes that? Vancouver's climate is moderated by the ocean, the Pacific Ocean over here. And Winnipeg is in the middle of the continent, doesn't have those moderating temperatures. In fact, cold air from the Arctic actually comes down this way. It makes it so much colder in the wintertime. Pushes everything down. So ocean currents are very important. Now here's this Gulf Stream I was telling you about. So down in the Caribbean, we have this warm body of water that's flowing up. You see it's flowing right by Nova Scotia here. So all the beaches in Nova Scotia and PEI are nice and warm. They're just like the ones down here in Virginia and the States. And the water crosses the Atlantic, the current crosses and goes right by England here, Great Britain and Ireland. And they have some very warm winters as well. You've probably heard of Ireland with its green pastures and that, but that's because it rains a lot there. They don't get much snow. I lived in Scotland for a year when I was traveling around Europe, and I think I saw snow once, and it didn't lie. What it means is it melted right away. But if you came to Canada, especially Bathurst, we'll have about 6 meters or 6 feet in one snowstorm. It's just amazing how much we get here. So here, this warms it up. In fact, this area here is so much warmer, but if you went to Moscow And you see those Russians wearing those great big like beaver hats because it's so much colder over there because they're in the continent. They don't have the Gulf Stream warming it. So the ocean current makes a big difference in their climate. And here you can see it in the satellite imagery. Look how it crosses here. That's red here is the temperature gradient. So you can see how it goes right across the Atlantic like that. Warm, warm current of water. And that's called the Gulf Stream. The second thing, or I should say the fourth thing now, because we looked yesterday at latitude and we looked at altitude. Now we're looking at ocean currents, and the fourth big effect on climate is local geography. It means what is the land like for where you live? So how far are you above sea level? Well, here in Bathurst, we're not too far. If you were to look at a map of Bathurst, you'll probably see that we're only about a meter or two above sea level for most of the city. When you have a little storm surge, anybody down U-Haul has big problems. And that's why if you go down their beaches, they have those great big cement and boulders and stuff there to protect against the ice coming in. But if we have the sea level rising here for a meter, which is expected by 2050, then you're going to see a lot of downtown Bathurst being flooded. That's that brewery they're building down here. I hope we can float, because I think even here, we may find that if you were to live to be close to 100, you may find a lot of this area in Bathurst is going to be wet. Temperature falls about 6 degrees for every 1,000 meters. It means that as you go up, the temperature in the air goes down. So from the ground, sea level, as we go up into the sky, for every 1,000 meters, it loses 6 degrees Celsius. I don't know if any of you have flown in an airplane, but a lot of airplanes will fly up about 35,000 feet. Not only is it pressurized, but if you were to, that window would break and you'd get out, you'd freeze. It's like in some of the planes now, if you have a television screen, they'll show you the temperature outside is like minus 50. So the higher you go, the colder it gets. Which is why when you go into outer space, those spacesuits, not only for oxygen, but they have to be heated because they'll freeze to death out there. Mountains cause rising warm air to cool and will release its moisture on coastal side. And I don't know if I showed you that picture yesterday or that little diagram, but if you have the Pacific Ocean here and the mountains, so if you got the air rising, the warm air rises, it gets up here, starts to snow, and then loses all that moisture, and when it comes down to Alberta, is dry air. So that's what the local geography can do to change your climate. So on the coastal side, it releases its moisture, and when on the landward side, this will be the coastal side where the water is, and this would be the landward side. And on this side here is where it's dry, like Alberta. When the air crosses the mountain, it dries, it descends, draws up the moisture from the land, sometimes developing a wind or a desert. So, this is what's called a relief map of the world. And you probably can see that there's some darker orange areas here. I'll just raise it a bit. See this here? Does anybody know what those are? Those are the Rocky Mountains. That's in Western Canada. Those are the mountains. And here, these are the mountains on in South America. Those are the Himalayas, Tibetan Plateau. I worked there for a year over here in the Tibetan Plateau in Western China. It was up 5,000 meters. It's kind of dry up there. Only the Tibetans, they're nomads that live there. And the first time you go, you can actually have, most of the guys I know, drillers came in, they used to get altitude sickness. They would throw up, they'd get dizzy like being in a bad drunk. But you have to adjust to it. You can't sleep very well because your REMs, you dreamed, a lot differently because there's not much oxygen up there. And it takes a while to climb it. You can't run, you have to walk for a while until you get used to it. But after working there, I used to go for 6 weeks at a time. When you come out, come down, my God, the energy. Like you could go for days and feel great. It's just like having a Gatorade rush, or what do you call it, Red Bull thing that you drank for 2 days. You're so hyped up. And that's because you're working with less oxygen up there. So when you see these things like this, the relief, that means there's high mountains. But we also know that areas like this near the equator, we have lots of deserts. They're very, very dry. So whether you're very low or very high determines what type of climate you have. So at a very grand scale. So we have deserts here, what they call the outback of Australia. We have deserts over in here. We have deserts even inside the mountains here. There's one called Death Valley, right in western U.S., right around in there. Canada, actually, we have the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, where they grow apples and grapes and everything. That's a desert as well. And those are generally called hot deserts. There's also cold deserts. Cold deserts are in the Arctic. Also, we have a cold desert in Mongolia over here. Very, very sparse, but you don't have cactus growing there. You just have, there's no trees, and you get a lot of, well, there's camels living there too. They're the only ones that can survive for a long, long time without water. Where I worked, when I drove, I used to have to go through a desert in Shanghai, and then we would take 4 hours. I'd go through a desert, and then I'd see the Mongolians, and they rode camels. And they kept camels. And then when I went way up high in the plateau, the Tibetans, they raise yak. They're like a buffalo. And they're Buddhist, so they wouldn't kill anything. What's interesting is that they would sell their animals for meat, but they wouldn't kill it themselves, because they don't believe in killing animals. But they would raise them. So in Canada here's our Rocky Mountains. They go all the way up to Alaska. And here you have Vancouver Island, Victoria, Vancouver right here. Right inside here, we're getting the Okanagan Valley. There's a little bit of a desert. Now we get over here, we get to the prairie provinces. You see that's a lot lighter cover. That's Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. That's where a lot of wheat is grown. Then you get into all of these forests. It's called a boreal forest. So all of these are those evergreen trees that go all the way across Canada. In the southern part of Canada, down in Ontario here, we got a lot more hardwood, maple, ash, and stuff. And of course, up in the Arctic, there's no trees, they're just tundra. And the animals, I worked up there for a couple summers, and when I arrived there in June, there was snow on the ground, and then in July, everything is gone, mosquitoes are out, all the beautiful animals are out, and then middle of August, we're in blizzards again. So it's a very, very short summer. We used to play frisbee at 3 o'clock in the morning. The light was still on. Didn't go down. 3:30, the sun go down. 4 o'clock, sun's back up. So in our tents where we slept, we had to put garbage bags on the windows so we'd be dark, so we could sleep because it was light most of the time. So what causes the seasons? Well, you probably know that's because the Earth is tilted. It's tilted on its axis, and it rotates above the axis. Okay? And as it goes around the sun, you'll notice that here, this part of the Earth is getting direct sunlight, so it's warmer. So that's where it's going to be summer. Over here, it's going to be winter. So this part here is summer. We get up here and come around to the other side. Everybody on this side of the world is going to have it colder, and over here, we'll have it hotter. So we can see that as the Earth rotates, how we are respected to the sun determines what our climate is. So we're going to have autumn here, winter over here, spring here, and summer over here. Because depending on, this is say for Europe, they're going to have summer at this part of the rotation, and up here they're going to have springtime and then winter. And you'll notice that if you're living down in Australia, it's just the opposite. If you're here, In the northern part, you got sun. But if you're down in the south part of South America, like in Argentina and that, they have the opposite seasons. So seasons result from the Earth's axis and its orbits around the sun. And that's because our planet is tilted relative to the sun. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. And the last thing that affects the weather is volcanoes. In the past, in Earth's history, we had lots of periods of lots of volcanoes. And even in our man's record time, when humans were recording history, there have been some massive volcanoes that when they send up the ash like this, it goes up so high and is blown by the wind, and it goes around the planet, and it will shield the sun, make it dark, and that ash will actually affect the weather, and it will affect climate. So this one here in 1815 in Indonesia, called the coldest year on record for many areas of Europe and North America. So one volcano, a very big one, changed the climate for a lot of part of the world. And why? Well, 25 cubic kilometers. That's a big block of ash that was put up into the atmosphere, and the winds blew it around the world, and it caused a lot of change. We all probably read about or heard about the major one that killed the dinosaurs. That wasn't a volcano, but that was an asteroid, thing from outer space that hit down there in Mexico, and it was such a big explosion, it threw ash up into the atmosphere, and of course it made it dark. It got dark, the sun wasn't there, and those animals were used to having lots of food, plants, and heat. And of course, over millions of years, that climate had changed and they eventually died. It didn't happen overnight. It took a long time to happen. So, volcanic eruptions can also affect the climate because they will shield the amount of sunlight that gets to the Earth's surface. So that's about it. We have 4 things that affect climate. We know that the local geography is one, depending whether you're in mountains or down in deserts. We also have the ocean currents. We have air circulation, and we have latitude. So those are the 4 main causes of climate. And their assignment will be just fill in the blanks, as well as some questions like what is the Gulf Stream. What I want you to do, I mentioned this to Brianna, but I want you to use this as a title page. Take each of these numbers on loose leaf and answer the question separately. Don't try and squish it into here, because some of these things you're going to need a sentence down. And make sure you have your name on there so I know who it's from. Today you're not going to be able to print it off, but hopefully we'll get something available for you tomorrow. I'm not sure if I have anything copied yet. Part A I have. No. So we're just going to have to wait for that printer. I put out 2 emails already to get the printer so you guys can print off the data. But you can use the screen right now, and you can put it on loose leaf for answers. Okay? All right, say tu, merci.